So what should your master CV look like? Well, there's no one-size-fits-all CV that works for everyone. Your CV will be shaped by your personal experience, qualifications and skills, and it will grow with you. However, there are some consistent topics that your CV will need to cover. As such, it's a great idea to have a master CV that always contains these foundations. You can then edit it for each particular role that you're applying for. With this in mind, let's quickly run through the most essential elements of a CV. To start, you'll have your name and contact details, preferably an email address and a phone number. You could also include your LinkedIn URL. Definitely don't waste space with the words curriculum vitae. There are a few other things that you don't need to include in the UK or Ireland, namely your age, gender and date of birth. It is also not standard practice to include a photo, but that's up to you. Many students choose to follow this with a personal statement or a profile. This is a sentence or two summarising your employment and educational background alongside your professional aspirations. Again, this isn't essential and you may not wish to include one. However, if you aren't able to include a covering letter as part of your application, a profile would be a very useful way to introduce yourself instead. Just be careful. The risk with personal statements is that they can come across as generic, bland or waffly. Avoid very broad statements that don't say anything unique about you, such as, I am a friendly, organised and creative English literature graduate with strong communication and teamworking skills. Instead, think more along the lines of an English literature graduate with editorial experience seeking opportunities within content marketing. Another important section is education and qualifications. Start with your most recent education, most likely your degree. How much detail should you go into? It depends. You don't need to go into detail on all of the modules that you studied unless they are relevant to the job application. This is particularly likely in technical roles, for example in engineering and IT. If you do mention particular modules, say what mark you got in them, or if you're still studying it, state this or your predicted grade. It is standard to include your subjects and grades for A-levels, Leaving Cert or equivalent. However, you don't need to list individual subjects and grades for GCSEs, Junior Certs or equivalent. It is better to say how many GCSEs, the grade range, and pick out one or two of your best subjects if relevant. You could also include details of academic prizes or awards in this section, as well as any online courses you feel are relevant to your application. Now, let's move on to your work experience or employment history section. An overarching work experience heading might suffice, but there are different ways to divide up and label your experience if appropriate. For example, if you have 2 or 3 pieces of experience in one area, you could group these under a more focused heading. Let's say you're going for a content marketing job and you've done a marketing internship, worked for your student newspaper and had a few part-time jobs. You could divide your sections into content marketing and editorial experience and retail and hospitality experience. Or let's say you started your own business as a student, was a course representative and sat on the committee of a student society. You could have a section called leadership experience. Or if you're looking to get into tech and have done an IT internship, as well as getting involved in hackathons and an entrepreneurial society at university, you could group these under a heading such as technology and innovation experience. As you can hopefully see, this approach is particularly helpful if there are experiences that sit outside the world of work, which you want to include as part of your suitability for the role. It ensures that any relevant experience is prominent on your CV and does not get lost in the interests or volunteering section towards the end. Ultimately, how you write up your experience will depend on how much you want to include. If you only have one piece of experience per area, you might be best sticking to one heading such as work experience. Whatever you do, definitely avoid splitting it into relevant and other work experience. This suggests that the other experience is not as relevant, which isn't going to do you any favours. Many employers do like to know how you enjoy spending your spare time beyond the workplace. Consequently, you may wish to include a section along the lines of hobbies and interests. Don't be too generic. For example, just saying you like to travel, who doesn't after all? Equally, it can give a personal touch to provide some specifics, but you don't need to go into too much detail. For example, if you say you enjoy backpacking, you might want to mention your recent interrailing trip or trek to Machu Picchu, or you might mention if you went independently or developed relevant skills, but you don't want to give them a blow-by-blow account of the experience. Be prepared to talk about the interests you mention in your CV, as they can become topics of conversation in interviews. And finally, references. You don't need to include contact details for your references on your CV. Instead, save space by saying references on request or omit this line altogether. It can be safely assured that you'll provide referees' details if you're offered a job. Ultimately, the best structure for your CV will depend on your own unique experiences and the job you're applying to. The only details you must always include in your CV are your contact details, work experience, and education. If there are other sections you want to include because they will add value to your CV, you can always do so. And you should always present the information in the order that best reflects your strengths and clearly shows how you match the employer's requirements. So, there you have essential components of a master CV. Once you have your master CV, you can then edit and add to it in line with the requirements of each job you're going for. For instance, you might want to make certain experiences and achievements more prominent, remove experiences that aren't as relevant, ensure your personal profile is directly relevant to the role you're applying for, and echo the recruiter's language. For example, if they want relationship building and you've talked about working in a team, you can change it to building good relationships with team members.